The line between upholding democracy and undermining it with judicial gatekeeping is razor thin. In the end, democracy's ultimate tribute should be the people, not the bench. And there's a peculiar kind of political pathology affecting democracies today: Britain, France, Turkey, Romania. It's neither a revolution nor a coup, but something quieter and more insidious, a condition in which the courts increasingly dictate the shape of politics. And at first glance, this might appear to be justice at work, but when you inspect more closely, you discover something unnerving, that this judicial interference was often invited, indeed legislated, by politicians themselves. This isn't an accident, it's a strategy. In the case of France, just yesterday, Marine Le Pen was convicted for alleged embezzlement of EU funds and banned from standing for election. Actually, I don't even need to use the word alleged. The conviction stands. And let's be clear, Yanis Varoufakis today, who is no sympathiser of Le Pen, indeed he calls her a fascist, nevertheless called the verdict ludicrous and mind-boggling. Why? Because, as he says, either the law applies to everyone or it applies to no one. Varoufakis isn't defending Le Pen's policies or politics. He's defending democracy. For when courts remove political contenders from the field, especially those leading in the polls, on technicalities or retroactively enforced rules, they are not merely enforcing justice, they're becoming players in the game they are meant to referee. And this, he notes, is not unique to France. In Romania, Georgescu, the right-wing presidential front-runner, was banned from running on similarly murky legal grounds. In Turkey, Erdogan's leading rival, the Istanbul mayor, the municipality leader, Ekrem İmamoğlu, was sentenced and disqualified from politics in what many observers in the West, particularly in the BBC, view as a politically motivated prosecution. It may be, it may not be. Yet in France, the same kind of judicial intervention is celebrated by so many in the Western media as the rule of law. Mind-boggling hypocrisy, Varoufakis concludes, and he's right. This isn't the rule of law, it's the weaponization of law. And then you've got the opposite, which is where countries like Britain, when the law says one thing, when the Supreme Court says that something is wrong, like Rwanda, the government promptly decides to legislate against it. And here's the twist. These are not rogue courts acting of their own volition. In both France and Turkey, the judiciary is acting in accordance with laws passed by the very politicians now benefiting from their enforcement. The problem isn't simply the courts stepping into politics, it's that politicians design the courts to do exactly that out of a combination of cowardice and self-interest. And you see the same thing, by the way, in Russia. So that in the end, you could say, oh no, this is a legal decision. Is it? Take France's campaign finance regulations. They're so Byzantine that nearly any candidate can be found in breach. And the discretion granted to regulators is enormous. When Jean-Luc Mélenchon's allies were barred from standing because of a procedural violation, even centrist critics raised the alarm. These laws are crafted intentionally or not to permit the sidelining of dissenting voices, left, right, or otherwise. Now, consider Turkey. There, the banning of Kurdish parties such as the HDP has been routinely established by the Constitutional Court. The law allows disqualification for supporting terrorism, a conveniently elastic charge. Erdogan, of course, doesn't have to imprison his rivals in dark cells. He has laws to do that for him, if he wants to. And that's certainly an interpretation of the system. And what of Britain? We imagine ourselves immune to these trends, but at the end of the last government, as I say, something even more troubling occurred. Quite the reverse to what's happening in France and Turkey and Romania. Parliament began legislating against court rulings. Cases such as the Rwanda deportation scheme prompted MPs to pass laws that not only ignored judicial review, but sought to prevent it altogether. In other words, Parliament wasn't inviting judicial interference, it was gagging it. It's the opposite extreme. but born of exactly the same disease: short-termism and institutional vandalism by elected representatives desperate to avoid scrutiny, responsibility, or failure. Whether by handing power to the courts or stripping it from them, politicians are redrawing the boundaries of democratic governance to suit their immediate needs. And I think one should be very clear. In the case of Marine Le Pen, absolutely, if embezzlement is identified, then that might well merit a prison sentence, suspended or otherwise. It might merit a fine or otherwise. But for the courts to say, well, we are legally now enforcing the rules, and we are now preventing her from holding public office, that seems overreach. In the same way, there is overreach in Romania and Turkey, I think, in expecting a court to enforce a political ban. In effect, courts should be dealing with crimes. The political ban, if it happens, and it may be inevitable, as it should have been inevitable in Britain with the Mike Amesbury case, that should be enforced by the Parliament or by the people. That should be, if necessary, a knee-jerk response by the Parliament or the people, but it shouldn't be the courts that ban a politician from running. And in the same way that, in principle, a U.S. president can become can enter the White House even though they are in prison. That principle, I think, is a good principle. I remember it turning up in Doctor Who under Tom Baker. And why is it troubling when the courts exceed or tread on political territory like this? Because it erodes that sacred distinction. Why is it worrying when the politicians tread on legal territory? Because it erodes that sacred distinction. That the courts are meant to interpret the law, not direct the future of law, not direct the future of a policy. And politicians, in turn, are supposed to face the consequences of their decisions, not to subcontract them to unelected judges. And today we live in a world where where it is increasingly hard to say who governs us. Is it the courtrooms, or is it the politicians, the parliaments that hide behind them? Is it the law, or the selective enforcement of the law against whomever most threatens the incumbent order? And this is where instinct matters. Many people feel something is deeply wrong, but they cannot quite put their finger on what it is. That unease, that queasy sense that legality is being used to mask illegitimacy, that's not ignorance. That's conscience. And we need to listen to it, just as Pinocchio should listen to his conscience, because legality is not morality. Something may be legal, something may be convenient, even popular, but still wrong. And Varoufakis reminds us of Christine Lagarde, convicted in 2016 on similar charges to Le Pen, but who faced no such political exclusion. She ascended to the presidency of the European Central Bank. Nobody raised a peep. One law for the governors, another for the governed. And when the courts are used to remove political opponents, especially front runners, we don't strengthen democracy, we defile it. And when those exclusions are the product of laws deliberately crafted to allow such disqualification, we have moved from legalism to authoritarianism in liberal drag. We have become Putin. We have become Putin, and we are imprisoning our adversaries. And the Western media will confidently say, "Oh, Alexis Navalny is the rightful opposition of Putin." Alexis Navalny could never have become president. He was a perfectly reasonable fellow, but he was not a president. He was not a serious opponent to Putin. But he was part of that opposition movement, and he led that opposition movement. But in the crucifixion of Alexis Navalny, in the murder of Alexis Navalny, Putin confirmed Alexei Navalny as the opposition. And Alexei Navalny was a brave and principled individual. Did he die in vain? I don't know. Putin will now be defined, I think, by Alexei Navalny. History will remember the two of them together. Ultimately, democracy is not just about rules, it's about legitimacy. And legitimacy flows from the people, not from the pages of statute books designed by the fearful and enforced by the convenient. The greatest danger to democracy today is not the mob, nor the military, but the legislator who writes the laws, himself, herself, and the judge who mistakes power for impartiality. To those who say the law is the law, I would say not all laws are just, and not all justice comes from the law. We have to be really careful about the balance, and we have to always remember Parliament is there to refine, to rephrase, to redress the laws that don't work. Parliament is there to recognise that law isn't always right, and the law courts are there to test whether or not Parliament's decisions and Parliament's laws work in practice. There are many bad laws on the statute books, many, many bad laws that cannot be implemented, laws that the police cannot enforce. They should be repealed. A tidy country repeals a bad law. If a law is not supposed to be there, if an aspiring politician tells the public that he doesn't want to enforce the Rwanda law, then there is only one conclusion. There is only one solution, and that is to repeal that Rwanda law. And yet Keir Starmer hasn't done that. Keir Starmer is sitting on 3 appalling laws in Britain. The Rwanda law, the Nationality and Borders Act, and the Illegal Immigration Act, all the brainchild of Suella Braverman and the aberrant Home Office. All of those laws need to be repealed because they are an affront to the international order, and they are offensive to morality. Now, there may be aspects of those laws which are important and which are useful. Well, then we need another law to replace them. We need a revision. And a tidy government would make sure that is a priority. This is not a tidy government, the one we've got at the moment. This is a government careering from one crisis to another. It's barely got in the door, and the world is exploding around it because it doesn't really know what it's doing, because it wasn't elected on the principle of doing something. It was elected because the previous government had become so toxic, and anything was better than more of Suella Braverman. But there we are. That's the problem. The law is there to do the law. The politicians are there to do politics. When those two get confused, we have a serious problem, and Varoufakis is quite right.